Welcome to Philosophy 15. I'm Scott Aiken.
And I'm Robert Talese.
We're the authors of Why We Argue and How We Should and Political Argument in a Polarized Age. This is the second episode on the Democrats' dilemma, Rob's new coinage and big idea. We had introduced the dilemma in the previous episode and then posed a kind of a challenge that had kind of come from you might say, the deliberative democratic program. So, Rob, give us a nutshell version of the dilemma, and then remind us what the deliberative Democrats' objection is.
Sure. So the dilemma, very quickly stated, is the conflict, or resides in the conflict that I think is internal to the office of democratic citizenship, where you've got two normative directives that are constitutive of that office that can pull apart. One directive is, see justice get done in the political world. Do what you can to realize and further justice. The other is, recognize your fellow citizens as your political equals, which means treat them with a certain kind of regard that manifests your acknowledgement of them as your equals. It seems that these two things pull apart when the stakes are high, when we think that the issue is really important. It seems like if Scott and I disagree about the substantive policy question, I have to see Scott as not merely wrong, but in the wrong, right? And it becomes then it looks as if the responsibility to treat him as my equal looks like it's a kind of concession to injustice. And for that reason, a kind of dereliction of my duty to see justice get done, right? I'm giving comfort and aid, right, to injustice.
To agents of injustice.
Yeah, good.
And an institution that then would promote it.
That's right.
Okay.
Good. That's the dilemma. Now,
so one of the challenges to this is that this is all assuming that there are, you might say, no non-negligent, or you might say, or in all of the instances of these disagreements or this sort of slippage are not epistemically negligent. That if we improve the epistemic circumstances and of deliberation, then consequently a lot of this is going to be mitigated, and even in terms of the norms of deliberation that are supposed to happen there. Tell us a little bit more about that Deliberativists' response.
Yeah, so it seems to me that the deliberative Democrats, along with a lot of other democratic theorists of other kinds, give short shrift to the dilemma, because they think that when the responsibility to and responsibility for obligations pull apart, that just shows democratic failure. Somebody's not doing what they should be doing. Institutions aren't set up the way they should be set up to realize democracy. And I want to suggest, no, right? You get this dilemma even under the most favorable, unrealistic assumptions about democratic citizens, because fundamental disagreements about normative matters are not going to go away. They are not a signal of failure to think, or that's just not, that strikes me as a utopian premise. Say, when democracy is doing its job, disagreement melts away.
Right. We get consilience when democracy works.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
It's a kind of bad reading of Rousseau that makes that the central piece of democracy.
Yeah, or like with the Rousseau, it's almost voluntary. It's like, it's because we all agreed on this, and it makes it right.
That's right.
Yeah, and it's what you should be doing.
That's right. It's not even all. It's the majority.
The majority does it.
Yeah, if the majority agrees, that then you just change your mind about it. Okay. So,
all
right. The deliberativists and other democratic theorists seem to think that the dilemma emerges only when democracy is imperfect or failing, and that there's therefore some tweak we can make to how citizens interact, to how the institutions work, to what happens, before people start arguing about politics, that is going to align or guarantee that the responsibility to justice, for doing justice, and the responsibility to our fellow citizens never pull apart. Another line, not strictly associated with the deliberativists, that tries to dissolve this, just says, look, the responsibility for justice entails the responsibility to treat your fellow citizens as your equals. A failure to treat your fellow citizens as your equals is itself an injustice.
That's right.
So
they failed in that.
Yeah. So this is not really a dilemma.
Right.
You always resolve the Democrats' dilemma in favor of the responsibility for justice, because the responsibility for justice directs you to treat fellow citizens as equals.
Okay.
Now, it strikes me that let me put it this way: I think it's right.
That's a cute argument. Cute is maybe too dismissive. That's a nice argument.
It's a very, very nice argument. It's very tight. I think it's got the right conclusion. I'm even going to say. I think that the obligation to justice does underwrite and give you sufficient moral reason to treat your fellow citizens as your equals, even when you see them as depraved within a certain spectrum of opinion.
So far we're in agreement with the objection. The question here is how that ice gets cut
good.
The dilemma.
This is a
because that's you concede everything about the objection.
That's right.
You say not an objection. That's not an objection.
Yeah, good. Right. This is a Bernard Williams kind of thought. It's like gets the right conclusion just too quickly. Right. It dismisses the dilemma, because I want to say, well, wait a minute. Let's think about the office of democratic citizenship from the perspective of the politically engaged, responsible, competent, democratic citizen. This is not just an exercise about conflicting normative requirements. This is a dilemma that's posed, I think, that is actually felt and that is actually struggled with among politically engaged democratic citizens. And there's empirical reason that we've got really good empirical data that shows that the more engaged, the better informed, the more active you are as a citizen, the more likely you are to feel the pinch of this dilemma. The more often
deeply conflicted you're going to feel about this.
The more often you have the thought, or the more likely it is that you have the thought about your political opponents. I don't owe them anything. After all,
and then you list off all the terrible things they're committed to.
They're on the side of injustice. I'm working for justice. What do I owe?
What do I owe them?
Yeah, I don't know. Truth doesn't owe anything to error. I don't owe anything to injustice. Now, I think that there's a
So, by the way, that almost sounds like an argument against deliberativism. The more you know, the worse you feel the dilemma, bud. That's a contingent feature of this, not a necessary feature, but that's an unhappy consequence, bud.
I'm unhappy for some, I guess. I'm not sure if it's all that unhappy for me, but
it's unhappy for democracy. Is that?
I'm not. Well, I'm not.
Okay,
sure.
so let's hear.
Not sure.
Okay,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure what to make of it. I just want to say that it's not an intellectual or an abstract exercise about conflicting obligations.
Right.
It's about a conflict of obligations that are felt by citizens when they are deeply invested in doing what they need to do and ought to do, qua democratic citizens. It's internal to the office of citizenship, and it's part of the experience of being a citizen. And I think that
surely our viewers feel this conflict.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Even when you say things like, well, the wrong guy won the election. He duped everybody.
Right.
That's a response
that's
to
the non-democratic
conflict.
response, as opposed to saying the wrong guy won the election. He's my president now.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. So, I don't think you could dismiss this. I think that there's something really important about democracy that we need to learn by looking very seriously at the dilemma, which I want to say in another way, just looking at the morally compromised position that democracy imposes on us. And so, one thing about treating the dilemma as something that emerges in the office of democratic citizenship rather than just in the abstract world of democratic theory, a lot of the dilemma as we experience it is driven by fairly robust political psychological tendencies. to think of our partisan affiliation as really central to our overall social identity. That's something that in the United States and in other democracies now, citizens tend to regard their political affiliation as more identifying of who they are at their core than their religious affiliation.
Ask any dating site.
Good, there's that, right? In the United States, people report that opposition to one of their kids marrying a partisan opponent is now more intense in the United States than opposition to their kids marrying somebody who's not their fellow religionist, or interracial marriage is more approved of than cross-partisan marriage in the United States. That is, our political affiliations have become so central to how we understand ourselves that the Democrats' dilemma arises because, again, we're thinking just all the thoughts you should think as a democratic citizen. I want to have an effective democratic voice. I've got to maintain my coalitions with people who are like-minded. I got to join. If I want to have an effective democratic voice, I've got to join a choir. Like that? That's in the book, by the way.
Nice.
I got to join a choir. If I want to join a choir, I've got to keep the choir cohesive.
We got to stay together on this.
We got to stick together.
Yeah.
And all of the political psychological forces, and some of the epistemic forces even, like in the belief polarization cases, show that it is a winning strategy for maintaining coalitions, for making them efficacious, and for encouraging cooperation among allies, for allies to express dismissive, disparaging attitudes
part of establishing
towards
that
the other
community.
side.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah.
And a good way to get yourself ostracized, or a good way to be looked at with suspicion among your allies, is to say, well, wait a minute, I know that they're wrong, but
it's to stop the outgrouping.
Yeah, that's right.
It's like not even to be belong to or even express sympathy with, but just to be like, hey, that's a little, isn't that hasty?
That's right.
You're breaking the spell, bud.
That's right.
You just broke the spell.
So standing up for the responsibility to your fellow citizens who are your political opponents weakens in the short run at least, looks like it weakens political coalitions, because your allies start looking at you like your opposer.
You're easily poached by them.
That's right. Now, right, you know, the black sheep effect. Have we ever talked about the black sheep effect?
What's the black sheep effect?
The black sheep effect. We have more intensely punitive and negative attitudes towards lapsed members of our own coalition than we do to our outright enemies.
That's right.
So
apostasy is the worst crime.
That's exactly right.
Because you knew the truth. You were so close to the truth. That's right. You said, not so much.
You were one of us, and now you're not. So displaying the attitudes that your political opponents are nonetheless your equals is a way of getting you ostracized, getting you looked at, marked as a poser, and drawing the ire of your political allies.
Because what that does is not just punishes you, it makes sure that because punishing apostates is not just for the apostates, it's for all the potential apostates in the audience.
That's right.
It says that this is what happens.
See what
you get when you leave the flock. Choirs stand together.
So look, that's exactly right. So you can see, like, wait a minute, the Democrats' dilemma again. We haven't attributed any substandard democratic motives or attitudes or dispositions.
Let's say we're being totalitarians in the midst of this. No.
Citizens doing what they should be doing as democratic citizens expose themselves to this kind of conflict.
And they feel it inside. And and so the crucial thing is that this is an explanation for the cognitive so you might say the cognitive phenomenology.
That's right.
What it's like to be a democratic citizen. This explains that conflicted feeling.
That's right. So all that is to say that the quick and dirty dismissals or resolutions of the dilemma well, if people were just thinking or talking or deliberating better, you wouldn't get the.
In some ways, they're really just restating the dilemma.
These are dodges. These are dodges.
Okay.
Right. Justice always takes precedence over the requirement to treat people as equals. These are dodges. I think that any democratic theory that has any interest in being engaged and actionable and pragmatic has to say, wait a minute, this is no simple this is not the Democrats' dilemma is not the result of some kind of confusion or not really thinking robustly enough about the responsibility for. This is something that really emerges in the experience of the democratic citizen, qua
in situ,
democratic citizen.
Yeah.
And any democratic theory that wants to promote a conception of democracy that's not simply voting and campaigning and coalition building and pulling levers, any democratic theorist who wants to promote a more substantive, a more normatively substantive conception of democracy has got to confront it and figure out what to say about it.
Philosophy 15, making bigger problems.